This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, filmmaker Jesse Moss on gaming out and insurrection.
The motivation for the game for that voice was there were three retired U.S. generals who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, your newspaper, calling on the country to consider this threat, the potential for lethal chaos in the U.S. military. That was the motivation for the game designers, to imagine the unimaginable. That's hard to do. That's a kind of taboo, right? I mean, there's a reason that we don't want to give ourselves permission to think about these consequences. I think conventional wisdom would say you can't even cut through in the news cycle with a film that's political. But I think we feel like the film's coming out at the right time.
Jesse Moss, welcome to Chatter. Thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, Shane, thanks for having me.
So we are here to talk about your latest film, War Game, which I will start by noting for listeners is set on January 6th, 2025. That date is not a coincidence. Give us the overview of the plot and why this particular date for your film is so significant to what this film is about.
Yeah, it's not often you can make a documentary set in the future. It's kind of paradoxical, isn't it? But that's what made it really an interesting project. It's a war game run by a veterans organization set in the future. The date is January 6, 2025. It imagines the next insurrection. Congress is convening to certify the electoral vote. The Senate is, and it imagines not the current candidates, but fictional candidates. The vantage point is the White House Situation Room and the president and his advisors, played by veterans of the past 5 presidential administrations. And they war game what happens when this insurrection spreads around the country and members of the active duty military join the insurrection. And the country is facing a graver crisis than we experienced on January 6, 2021. And we get to watch the president and his advisors wrestle with a decision to invoke the Insurrection Act, which is something we can talk about more.
Yeah. So what was it that drew you to this film? I mean, was this an idea that you had? Was this the group doing a simulation and you said, I'd like to go in and film this? What's the origin for that?
Well, there are a few things that intrigued me about this. One is just on a personal level, carrying around the traumas that I think most of us carry from January 6, 2021. What did that event mean? Obviously, its meaning is contested, depending on where you stand politically. But I think I have unresolved feelings, and it worries me about our democracy, what it foretells, the rise of political violence in our country. So I was looking for a way to confront them in myself. And I learned about this exercise from some colleagues who work in the entertainment industry. They themselves had learned about that voice running this exercise. Mm. And when they told me about it, this was we shot the film on January 6, 2023. Mm. So an auspicious date. But I learned about the exercise a few months earlier, and I thought, how extraordinary. This is, first of all, formally really interesting. It's a documentary, but it's set in the future. It's a improvisational exercise. I made a film about a war game about 15 years ago, so I'm familiar with the concept, albeit that was very different. And I was curious what would happen in this war game. You know, would the country split apart? Would we have reconciliation and national unity? I wasn't sure. So I wanted the answer to that question. I was fascinated by the theatrical space of the exercise. And I love that we've had a lot of autopsies on January 6, 2021. We've had the J6 committee, we've had the report, we've had various documentaries, sort of all looking backwards and trying to make sense of that event. But this was different. This was not familiar footage. This was from the vantage of the White House Situation Room, a space I've never been in, but I imagine interesting things happen there. I'd seen that picture of Obama and his advisors when bin Laden was assassinated, Mm-hmm. So I thought, wow, this is an opportunity to kind of step into a really interesting space with people it's a bipartisan exercise, I should say, and also former members of the military who consider themselves to be nonpartisan. So an interesting collection of people. And I thought, if we can get access, this could be a really interesting film and a way to confront these questions and think about our future and the state of our tenuous state of our democracy. So, often with a doc project, it's about access. I think we were fortunate in that Vet Voice, which is not a government agency or organization, was open to letting us in with our cameras. I think they saw value in us telling a documentary story of what they were doing. They were going to prepare a report and share that with policymakers, but they felt that a documentary could be of value. So they said, yes, let's talk about it. And from there, we began to sort of sketch out some ground rules.
The veterans group in this really plays a key role. They're actually two of the members of this group are the first people that we see driving around Washington looking very menacing as if they might be, insurrectionists. But what we come to learn is that they're part of this group of former military members, right, that is trying to raise awareness about the threat of anti-government activity inside the military. So talk a little bit about them and how do you persuade them to say, let us kind of come into the circle here and film this pretty sensitive scenario that you're setting up?
Well, actually, it's you're right. The film opens with a fascinating scene that might have been shot before January 6, 2021, but is actually happening now. It's two guys they're military veterans. They look like veterans, beards, young.
Yeah, they look tough.
Clearly know a thing or two about assessing the weaknesses of a building, or in this case, they're casing Washington, D.C. in the Capitol, planning an attack. I think audiences can perceive that immediately. What makes it interesting, what we learn, is that they are experts on extremism. They've been recruited by Vet Voice to help the organizers of the game to model and invent a fictional extremist movement. And that they do. And in the game itself, they become what's called the red cell. In a war game, you have the good guys who are the blue cell, the government officials, and you have the red cell, the bad guys. And they play the bad guys. And they're really good at what they do. They're both combat veterans. One was in Iraq, one was a Marine in Afghanistan. And they bring those perspectives and experiences to modeling, inventing, and then sort of tactically organizing their movement. But if I could back up for a second, Shane, the motivation for the game for Vet Voice was there were three retired U.S. generals who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, your newspaper, calling on the country to consider this threat, the potential for lethal chaos in the U.S. military. I think it's I'm sure, as you know from the J6 hearings and the report itself, sort of the National Guard's, the military leadership and the National Guard and their role or lack of role in the insurrection on January 6th is somewhat contested, confusing, why there wasn't a more vigorous response to protect the Capitol. And I think that we also know that 1 in 5 defendants in that event, January 6, 2021, were people with military experience. So, and it's nothing new. I think the military, as Janessa Goldbeck, who runs Vet Voice and is herself a Marine, says the military is a representation of our country, for better and sometimes for worse. And there are extremists in the military. And this game contemplates the threat they present if there's a fragmentation in the military. So the generals called on the country to consider this threat in the next insurrection, if there were to be one. And the government, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, the government is obviously a lot of people and institutions, I think, was afraid to take up that challenge, as far as we know, unless it was conducted in secret. And Vet Voice has a pretty extensive network of policymakers and defense and intelligence officials, and they decided to do it themselves. So they took up the challenge. And in order to build the exercise, they had the good guys, but they needed to kind of figure out who are the bad guys. So that's where this red cell comes in. Christopher Goldsmith and Chris Jones, the two men you meet in that scene, are, I think, the moral center of the film in a way. We learn about their personal stories, and they're complicated in the course of telling the story.
Yeah, and they really do kind of carry you through, I think, for the audience is a little bit of both the expert, like these are the two guys who were in the military, so they have a lot of credibility around planning how you might imagine something like this going out. But there's sort of also this voice of warning from people who've been in the military, have themselves been exposed to extremist influences. You could almost imagine a film just about them, right? But it's such an interesting way to go through the narrative when you situate it in this scenario. When people see the film, they'll, it's largely shot in this kind of situation room setting. But people who follow the news closely will recognize a lot of faces. There's, General Wesley Clark plays a role. Heidi Heitkamp is in it. Steve Bullock, the former governor of Montana, plays the president. But you really get the sense from watching it that as these developments in the scenario of the attack are kind of dropped on them and unfolding, they kind of seem like deers in the headlights at some point. And I'm wondering, what was it like in the room as these, things are playing out and they're just completely new to these participants, all of whom, by the way, have served at senior levels of government before?
Well, it was terrifying for us to raise the money and build the team to shoot this film. And it was shot on one day, as I mentioned, January 6, 2023, at a hotel.
Yeah, one take.
Essentially one take. You get one shot to get it. And in a hotel, we learned where insurrectionists themselves had stayed. So there were actually kind of demons lurking around us as we filmed. And I think that the role players brought that weight of responsibility and anxiety to the exercise, but they're not scripted. Their actions are based on their own experience, their life experience. They've either sat in those chairs or been proximate to those positions in government, but they don't really know each other either. So it's sort of thrown together. It's about 25 in the situation room, and we built the set. Feels like if it takes inspiration from Dr. Strangelove, but also the real situation room. So we were given permission by Vet Voice to kind of typically these are windowless, drab conference rooms, but they said, well, if you can give us a set that sort of elevates the drama, I think the role players will buy in more. And so we, given that permission, we did do that. And I do think it had an effect on the kind of the seriousness and intensity of the gameplay. But to answer your question, we didn't know whether this would work as a film, frankly, or as an exercise. And it's what I love about documentary. It's totally unscripted. It's a little terrifying. We were there with our crew, 6 cameras to capture every moment, but not until essentially the clock starts. There's a clock in the room counting down 6 hours to 0. That's how much time they have to figure out this crisis in real time. Not until the game started did we know if this would work. But the moment I think Heidi Heitkamp addresses Steve Bullock as Mr. President, there was clearly buy-in. And you're right. They are kind of overwhelmed at the events that are happening around them as they begin to escalate. And we see, I think, fear, anxiety, tension, anger, all of those feelings as they begin to try to work out what the right response to this metastasizing insurrection should be. And this new threat of fragmentation in the U.S. military. So there is again, the candidates are not Biden and Trump or Harris and Trump. They are fictionalized. And it's a contested election, so the outcome is called into question by the losing candidate, not called Donald Trump. His Strickland is his name. And we begin to see, I think, sort of in broad strokes and granular detail, how the U.S. government needs to respond to this. And I was transported. I thought we've got something here. And I would say the same for my co-director, Tony Gerber. We were watching a bank of monitors. We had communication to the camera operators who were in the room. But it's documentary. You're not really directing people. And I think we didn't know if they could play themselves, I guess. I mean, they're real people playing versions of themselves. It's a strange version of theater, but fascinating. And we bought in.
I've done a couple of war game scenarios before where I play the role of a journalist, and people do seem to buy in pretty quickly. At first, you think, "Oh, this is going to be very awkward, and we're suddenly going to start addressing this guy as Mr. President." But there's something about the moment, and I think that probably for people who had remembered January 6th, but also this plot line starts spinning into different directions where there are other kind of insurrection elements happening. There are bases being infiltrated by insurrectionists or possibly taking over. They seem to buy into it pretty quickly. Talk about how also the game is sort of programmed. I mean, part of the film is we see these people sitting in kind of a control room, if you like, and they're really the game operators, and they're dropping in elements and developments as they go. And, sometimes it feels like maybe even the players are getting ahead of where the plot line imagines. So talk a little bit about how they kind of feed the plot elements to the participants.
The game is not scripted, but there is a kind of framework that's devised by the scenario team, or the white cell, it's called. We see them in the film. They're wearing headsets. They're looking at the same monitors that we are, and they're kind of policing the action. But there's not much that they need to do. What they have designed, and we actually spent a day with them a month before the war game was run, and I remember going in there and frankly being a little suspicious about the organization and the credibility of people involved. At that point, they had not yet cast the roles of the president and his advisors. And I remember this was in D.C. I walked in, and there was General Mike Hayden, former director of the CIA. And I thought, okay, well, he's a fairly credible person. Whether you agree with him and his politics or not, he knows a thing or two. Yes. And General Paul Eaton was there. Colonel Alex Vindman, we know, who was served in the Trump White House and, famously informed on Trump's call with Zelensky and then became a witness in the impeachment hearings. So really interesting people with credibility. And what I think I valued, and most of us can value, is that the organization running the exercise, they're veterans. They're not critiquing the institution or questioning it from without, but rather from within. Janessa Goldbeck, who runs the organization, was a Marine. And so they have really, I think, credible backgrounds. And they have, we see them, actually this is not in the film, but what we saw on that day was writing the scenario. And by that, I mean, there were certain key events that they have sort of pre-programmed to escalate the drama. They call them tentpole injects in the language of wargaming. Maybe you know that from your past wargame experience. Almost like a screenwriter would devise an inciting incident, right. A first act turn, a midpoint break, escalating emotional drama. All of these events are serving to make the challenge the president faces more severe and different. And as I mentioned, this insurrection becomes a nationwide insurrection. It's not restricted to the Capitol. So there was a whole team devising. There was actually someone whose identity we can't reveal, someone who came with spooky background, kind of does this for the government, and that was interesting to me. But just an incredible team of designers. And you mentioned that our military veterans who devised the opposition force, they were at the table too. They had all kinds of ideas, some of which had to be reined in. So it was really interesting. It's like a writer's room on a Hollywood show, right? But
fascinating.
Really wanting to ground it in what is possible, what has happened before, and what is likely to happen in the future.
Yeah. And we should say, too, one of our Chatter co-hosts, David Priest, played the director of national intelligence in this. So there's a little bit of a Chatter cameo. And I think it's so interesting to hear you say that about how the plot develops, because at no point watching it did I get the sense that the participants were kind of, rolling their eyes like, oh, God, this would never happen, whatever. They were seemingly very alarmed, and they seemed to be getting very tense. And it was also fascinating to me how everyone from sort of the Homeland Security Secretary to the Secretary of Defense to the President's advisor, Heidi Heitkamp plays this kind of close advisor, are all kind of clamoring to get his attention and to try to influence him. And you have this wonderful scene at one point where there's this cacophony of Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President kind of going over everyone. It seemed like there was everything just comes back to the president has to make the decision. And you see this huge human infrastructure around him with all of this information. And yet it always comes back to one person having to make that call.
That was really interesting for me to see. And I think for our audience, it's a portrait, a vantage we really normally don't get. We see the president when they make a decision and, they sign a bill in the Rose Garden, or they announce an initiative or an executive action, but the decision-making process is something that's normally hidden from us. Maybe not you as a reporter. Obviously, that's one of the things you get into. But for most of us, it's just not. Those are not the rooms we're invited into, and people maybe have reasons to sometimes not share those decision making debates with us, right? And I think we get a sense of how difficult it must be for the president to wrestle with a decision like this that has grave implications for the country and its future. And this is role play, but you mentioned that the posture of the people in the room, and I think they were all drawn to this exercise not because they were paid, and not because they belong to one party or another. They don't. They're bipartisan, as I mentioned. Liz Newman served in the Trump administration in Homeland Security, and Heidi and Steve Bullock are fairly centrist Democrats. Wes Clark, you mentioned. I don't even know what David Priest's politics are. I guess maybe, but so but I think they were drawn together out of a common purpose to say we consider this to be a real threat. We're worried, and I think we feel that. It's rare also that we're in a room with people who have different politics and are trying to work something out to find common ground to sort of engage in civilly. I'll say the temperature rises and voices are raised in the room, as I expect they are in the White House Situation Room. People disagree, and the president has to be the honest broker, right? He has to take it all in. And I think we get to see, Bullock is playing the president, but he was governor of Montana, and he's used to executive power and probably taking in a lot of opinions. And, I made a film about Pete Buttigieg running for president.
Yes.
And it was an interesting experience for me. I spent a year with him on the campaign trail and in debate prep. And I expected Pete, who's brilliant, to, be the loudest voice in the room, but he's often not. He's a listener. And I think we've had presidents who are probably good listeners and presidents who are probably not. I won't name names, but my guess is some are better than others at taking in the counsel of their advisors. And this president, John Hotham, played by Steve Bullock, he takes it in. And it's a little frustrating for our audience, just sort of waiting for him to make a decision, right? Yeah. And he does eventually, and it's quite dramatic, and the action of the game hinges on the choice he has to make.
Well, anyway, we won't talk about that because I don't want to spoil it for people. But one of the themes that's so interesting to me, and I'd love to hear you talk about this, is the extent to which people in the room feel the need to maintain the credibility of the government and not make it seem like it's overreacting, that it's too heavy-handed. There's a lot of concern about activating the military to go in and try and suppress the insurrection. And I thought that was really remarkable, that people were being so careful and thoughtful about, okay, however we act, it's going to have these ripple effects throughout the country, and people are going to interpret it and respond because this is the federal government. It's this most powerful force.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of two perspectives that inform that challenge, which is the use of force to contain this uprising, this insurrection. And one is from Wes Clark. He talks about when he was in the military, the use of a single military vehicle to puncture David Koresh's Waco compound. And as we know, there was subsequently a fire. Many people were killed. It became a kind of a rallying cry for right-wing extremists. A case study of government overreach. And we can point to recent history, say over the last 40, 50 years, and see how even isolated instances of that kind of use of government force have really catalyzed a right-wing movement. And it's a kind of taboo in our history and our society. Obviously the use of active duty military is constrained for good reason. And I think that the Insurrection Act, which the film explores, this is the question the president wrestles with, gives the president the power to use the military on domestic soil, which has been done before in the LA riots. We learned President Bush did invoke the Insurrection Act and an attempt to police uprisings in Los Angeles. And yet there is the hazard of escalation and the potential to foment something we haven't seen since the Civil War, which is really Americans fighting Americans on home soil. So What's interesting too is the perspective of not just like Wes Clark, but also the Red Cell, these guys who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and have seen violent civil conflict up close in those countries torn apart, people fighting each other. And they make the comment that, part of what saved us, I think, democracy perhaps, is that there was not a more violent response to the insurrection on January 6, 2021. The DC police, the Capitol Police, did not shoot, right? And for that reason, things were terrible, terrifying, but could have easily been worse. And so this is the question that's posed in this scenario. And because the challenge to the president becomes more severe than what we witnessed 3.5 years ago, yeah. I think we, the audience, are really forced to grapple with this possibility. And, I'm sure as you know and have reported on this, Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act to police Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C. And this is not a theoretical proposition. I think that's what motivated me to want to make the film. Everybody who's playing a role in the film is that this is not science fiction,
right? And that was going to be my next question too, is, because Trump has talked about the Insurrection Act as a tool for essentially, policing via the White House almost. What did you come away with after this experience about your concern? You obviously were concerned about that before you made the film, but what did you learn, or what kind of questions has this film sparked for you about how President Trump or any future president could wield that authority politically and what they might do with it?
I think we have a responsibility to think about this question as much as we might not want to. And I think that was the motivation for the game designers, to imagine the unimaginable. That's hard to do. That's a kind of taboo, right? I mean, there's a reason that we don't want to give ourselves permission to think about these consequences. But if we've learned anything from the chaos, the political chaos, the escalating political violence and the coarsening of rhetoric, and that we have to think more expansively about these possibilities. And I think to think about the Insurrection Act, regardless of the outcome of this election, it's an issue, I think. For example, if Trump is not elected and Harris, say, is elected president, she could be facing, civil conflict like President Hotham faces in this scenario. But it's not a policy brief either. I think it's a film about de-escalation, about bringing the temperature down. And can we do that? How do we do that? What's the language to do that when people want to seem to, algorithmically are rewarded for driving it up? And we see, for example, in the game, there is misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. There's a social media network that was built for the game. The Red Cell, the bad guys, are really good at using those tools. As we know, they're in real life good at using those tools to recruit, but also foment. What we don't see in the game are state actors also kind of fomenting here. It was kind of fascinating as a game design challenge is what do you put in and what do you leave out, right? Because it's just a representation. You can't build the whole universe within the game. And so they had to sort of say, that's for another game. But I think that the film is about de-escalation. And people say it's the scariest movie of the year. It's a horror film, and it is that, right? But I think it's also provides a hopeful corrective, both in the values and commitment of the people involved, but also this reminder of a need to try to take the temperature down if we can.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, because I think sometimes maybe people who aren't as familiar with politicians and government figures who operate at this kind of senior level might have an idea of them sort of, in a room and sort of plotting to how can we suppress this, or like, let's go after them. And really, almost to a person, it seemed like these participants were exactly as you said, trying to figure what is the off ramp here? What is the way out of this? How do we bring it back down? And I think, and that is, they're sort of fighting a rising tide throughout the whole thing. But that struck me as more, realistic. And you make the point too that, on January 6th, the Capitol Police and DC Police did not shoot back. Restraint was sort of the order of the day. And I think it's because so many of those people in that room understand how very quickly this could get out of hand if you overreacted to it. And it seemed like that was what they were really trying to avoid. Yeah. I'm curious. Tell me about where you were on January 6, 2021 and what you remember of that moment.
I was home in San Francisco with my partner, Amanda, and watching, I must have gotten a news alert and we began to watch the events in real time. And I had a feeling I've only had maybe once before in my life when I lived in Lower Manhattan on 9/11 and watched the Twin Towers burn, which is that my brain can't process the imagery that it's seeing. And as is so often the case, we reach for movie language to help us. I just felt like, what alternate reality? What man in the high castle reality am I living in here? Where this building, which I worked in the U.S. Capitol as a young man in my 20s. I loved it. It's coming apart. It's being sacked by vandals. And I was horrified. I was in disbelief. And I put a lot of those feelings away. I followed the subsequent inquest to a degree, but I think that I carried, and we started the conversation, for me at least, talking about this trauma that I think many of us carry from the political chaos and that event and the violence of that event. We got all the police body camera footage from that day from the U.S. attorneys. And because you see selectively in the film a little bit of this violence from J6 and, but not too much of it. I think we didn't want to re-traumatize people. It's a little bit like that 9/11 footage of planes flying. Yeah. It's a kind of an obscenity, and after too much use, it sort of loses its meaning, right? But when we got all this footage, I don't know, hundreds of hours of body camera footage from Capitol Police, it's like hard to look at, but also necessary selectively to look at. So I think this film, the value of this film for me is that it sort of reframed the conversation in the sort of driest, calmest atmosphere of the Situation Room, the sort of most opposite space from the pillaged Capitol itself. And was a way, as I said, to sort of process some of the feelings that certainly I'm carrying around and to find what I think is a constructive framework to talk about them with other people. And I think, the film is in theaters now around the country. It's beginning to expand its theatrical release. And I sense a hunger in people. I just left a Q&A in Los Angeles, but a hunger for people just like you and me who want to process those feelings together. And maybe we've been uncomfortable or unwilling to do that even in our own family sometimes. I'm thinking about just discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's like I only talk about it with my partner because I think we know that bringing it up with anybody else is going to potentially lead to division, and it's hard to talk about this stuff. So I think people are still, there was an analogy that came to mind when I was trying to make sense of how people are responding to the film, and it was that, I don't mean to be presumptuous, but the Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa, right after apartheid fell, and as a way for the country to kind of heal and move forward. And how do we as a country heal and move forward? And this goes to the question you had posed about the effort in the Situation Room to manage this crisis. Is the president is conscious not just of containing the crisis in that moment, but he's got to govern the next day and the next day and the next day. He's got to govern the whole country and not a divided country. So I think that that's what we're all thinking about.
Yeah. And, one thing that I thought impressed me about the film is that, it doesn't spend, it seems to me, a lot of time trying to, or at least the participants don't, trying to litigate the contention at the heart of the contested election, right? There's not a bunch of time spent saying, oh, the votes were stolen here and the voting machine was hacked over here. And, so much, it seems to me, about the aftermath of January 6th is tied up in this dispute over, it's not really a factual dispute. I mean, it's demonstrably not true that votes were changed and the election was stolen, but it's tied up in that and not in the violent response to that act. And I'm curious, was it a choice of the game planners, or was it just a natural way that the scenario went, that the why we're here and the what is at the heart of the debate didn't feature so much in the crisis that's exploding, and how do we contain that?
Yeah, it's a good observation. I mean, the briefing book that players got was pretty thin, I'll say. There were a background on the contested election, how close the election was, therefore how credible the false claims by the losing candidate and his supporters that the election itself was stolen. But you're right, they don't litigate that question. That it does. They're confronted with there's an advisor in the room. I think is it Wes Clark, maybe another advisor who suggests that the president's opponent should be wiretapped, and yes. He's communicating with. There's a character in the game who's modeled on Mike Flynn, General Mike Flynn. Right. He's called the Patriarch, and he's a leader with military background, but also sort of a quasi-religious mantra and he has a kind of credibility to command these defectors, and not unlike Flynn. And so Wes Clark is saying we should wiretap your political opponent, and we should wiretap this Flynn character. And the president says, the Flynn character, yes. The president, my defeated opponent, no. Like, it's too, given the margin of victory here, it's too dangerous. People will find out, and it will feed this sort of vicious circle that we're in, right? So I think that they built a very credible scenario, and we know that there's a strong likelihood that if Trump is defeated, that he's laying the groundwork in the same way he laid it in 2020.
Yeah, and certainly, I know in our own reporting at the paper, when we talk to state and local officials, election officials, they are hoping it doesn't come to violence, but they're preparing for the possibility of it. And it just sort of seems like everyone takes it as a given. And it's worth emphasizing, too. We're talking about, when we talk about the scenario, that they're playing here, it's not one written by you and your producers. It's one written in part by people who served in the military. And I thought that was a really interesting choice for them to focus on this charismatic military figure who sort of blends religiosity and authority of different kinds. And you could absolutely see why people would follow that person. Mike Flynn is somebody who has served in very high levels of the government. There are certainly participants in your film who worked with Mike Flynn and have strong opinions about him. But nevertheless, he is somebody who will present to a large portion of the American public, as the character does in the film, as credible because they served. And that's one of the interesting things that this story grapples with, is it's not as though, the insurrectionists are represented by some, foreign force or, some, kind of like element completely out of nowhere. It has this kind of religious, non-state quality, but they're people who served, and there are people who in that scenario would have once been credible voices of authority in the country.
They bring an enormous amount of credibility. They fought insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now they're fomenting one here. That's the patriarch in our game. Yeah. And what's also, I think, credible and interesting is that it's not a spoiler to say in this game, beyond the U.S. Capitol and the insurrection we see there, that the Arizona State House is taken over. But the force that takes it over is composed of active duty military, but also law enforcement, sheriffs. And so it's a kind of amalgam of forces who bring, both the capability to deploy lethal violence, but also credibility. And that's what's totally destabilizing. We also talked earlier about the number of defendants in the January 6th insurrection who were military veterans. Veterans are recruited. I think Janessa Goldbeck talks about this, who leads Vet Voice. They're targeted for recruitment because they have the experience, but also the kind of the standing in our society, having served. So they're disproportionately targeted for recruitment. And there have been efforts to rein that in, but it's become a highly, as is so often the case now, such a highly partisan issue to police extremism in the U.S. military.
Yes.
To question the institution. So how do you do it? And I think that's part of the motivation here is to say we're doing this out of patriotism. That's a word that's also been sort of claimed by the right, but I think you see people in this film trying to reclaim. They don't call themselves patriots, but I would. I think they're acting out of a love of country and constitution to say it's our duty to question these institutions to make them stronger. That's what we do in the military. We war game to make our country stronger. So, if I could add one other thing, which we discovered when we first went to that writers' room meeting a month before the exercise, we met all the Vindman. I mentioned Alex Vindman and Janessa and this guy, Ben Rad, who's helping to design the game. And some of these guys who play the bad guys in the Red Cell is learning their personal backstories and actually in some cases the trauma, actually in really all cases, the trauma that they are carrying inside in their hearts that is motivating them. So it's not just a sense of political civic duty. It's actually they have pain. Janessa, her father has been drawn into QAnon. Chris Goldsmith served in Iraq and brought home a lot of pain and trauma. Alex Vindman, did what he felt was his loyal duty and lost his job in the administration. So I think that I felt something. I mean, we get to know their stories in the film a little. We cut away from the action to get to know them. And I think it's important that we get to know them.
There are moments in the film that you where you flash headlines. They are alluding to what you just said about how the military and the political leadership seems very reluctant to face head on this issue of extremism in the military, and that's within this Democratic administration that we're talking about. A lot of this policy response. What did you come away with? Whether it's Republican or Democrat, did you have a sense of why it is that policymakers seem so reluctant to come at this problem? What is holding them back, do you think?
Well, I think it's not unique to this issue, but many issues in Congress that to work with members of the opposing party on anything makes you vulnerable to partisan attack, right? You're seen as this is the situation we find ourselves in increasingly. We're sort of partisan loyalty trumps everything. And if you're going to lose your seat in Congress because you worked with the opposing party, or be attacked for it, there's just not enough incentive to find that common purpose, common ground, and address a problem that you might agree is worth addressing. So I don't think it's unique to this issue of extremism in the military. To get anything done these days in Congress seems, almost impossible, right? And and this issue in particular, we've got Trump describing these January 6th convicted felons as, patriots, or, I think that there are contested narratives here about what happened on that day, who was involved. Some very good, that was his description of the Charlottesville, right-wing protesters, right? Some very good people, right, on both sides is what he said.
Right.
Right. But, I think that, I think there's very little leeway to operate. And even as you say, in a Democratic administration, that those efforts have been stymied because they can't find common purpose to do it, to look at the problem. So this is a way of looking at the problem, to bringing the attention of the American people to the problem. That's another way to act. If you can't get consensus on Capitol Hill, at least we can educate the American people to say, this is not name calling. This is just calling out a problem that is hiding in plain sight. And I think that we have, as you know, as a reporter too, there's a kind of sometimes a blind spot, that sort of sits right in front of us that can be hard to look at because it's a taboo, or hard to look at because it's much easier to look in 100 other directions. But I think this film looks at that blind spot.
Yeah. So now, having immersed yourself in the imagined January 6th, 2025, as we're approaching Election Day and then the next January 6th, how are you thinking about this period differently than you did 4 years ago? What are things that you're concerned about that worry you? Are there opportunities that you think present themselves to find these off ramps? I'm curious what this experience has done to change how you're thinking about the next several months.
Well, this has been a white knuckle ride. I don't expect it to change. We have 12 weeks or so to the election, which is an eternity in the lifespan of a presidential contest. We have debates coming up. Who knows what's going to happen? We had an assassination attempt. In the film, we hear from Chris Goldsmith, who's playing the Red Cell, about the likelihood of. This was an interview we shot with him that was taped over a year ago, but talking about the likelihood of assassination. And I remember in the edit room debating whether we put that in the film. I thought that seems really far-fetched. We haven't had an assassination attempt on a presidential candidate since I was 10, right, or 12, in Reagan's assassination attempt. And but I think Chris is prophetic. So I'm holding on tight. It's a little nerve-wracking to take out a political film in an election year, and actually. I think conventional wisdom would say you can't even cut through in the news cycle with a film that's political. But I think we feel like the film's coming out at the right time. When we shot the film, Trump was way off stage, not considered to be the presumptive nominee. And the film is not necessarily about Trump. I think it's evergreen, but I think that I wish the film were not relevant, right? Our executive producer is Warren Littlefield. He's produced The Handmaid's Tale, and that's actually his line. He says, "I wish it were not relevant, but I do think it is." And so I'm an optimistic person though, and I think that we're required to hold those two truths at once, that we are facing an abyss and the terrifying possibility that these norms that we have taken for granted will be further shattered, but also that there are good people, and I have faith in the electorate, and we have good candidates, and I think there'll be a good outcome.
Yeah. You mentioned that you used to work in the Capitol building. Where did you begin your career, and how did you make your way into documentary filmmaking?
I was involved in political campaigns in college. After college, I went to work briefly in the Clinton White House in 1994. That was my introduction to DC life. It was amazing. I worked in the East Wing briefly in the Office of Legislative Affairs for the House. And then I graduated to work for a House member who was in the Democratic leadership. Who's chair of the Democratic caucus, and I worked for him at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee in 1994, the year the Democrats lost the House. So
that's a big year.
It was a big year, kind of destabilizing. The rise of Newt Gingrich actually sort of foretells the political moment we find ourselves in.
It does.
In a way,
does, absolutely. Yeah.
And I loved working as a young person in Washington. Even though the Democrats lost the House, I found it and we were in the minority. I moved over to work for Congressman Vic Fazio's. He was from California, where I'm from. I worked on his Democratic caucus staff. And I don't know, I loved being able to go into the floor of the House. That was a space that was familiar to me when I watched what was happening there.
Right. You'd been there. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought, what a privilege, what a space. So, and I was restless though. I loved my work, but I was restless. I met a filmmaker who was sharing a film in DC. And I was, it was the year 94 too, was the year that the War Room, that film about Clinton campaign.
Oh yeah. Great film. Yeah.
Carville and Stephanopoulos. And I saw it in a movie theater, and I love present tense filmmaking. I like that we were watching this story in real time. And of course it helps that Clinton won. If Clinton I say this having made a film about a candidate who lost. It's a different proposition when they win than when they lose. And I think the art form just kind of captured me, and I had been interested in journalism too, and I was restless in politics, and I impulsively quit my job and my benefits and my retirement plan and all that stuff, and I moved to New York, and started at the bottom of documentary was not what it's become since. There was no streaming television. It was really kind of rugged and independent. But and I actually didn't want to make political films. It's kind of taken me a whole lifetime of work to come back to making political work, because now I feel like it's hard, I think, to make a political documentary that stands out, that people want to watch. I mean, we're sort of inundated by those narratives and politics. I mean, the issues, there tends to be films that either are constrained by access, or films that just sort of deliver conventional received wisdoms and don't. I mean, I'm more interested in inhabiting what I call the fault line in American political life. I think the Buttigieg film's a little different, but I made these films called Boy State and Girl State for Apple. And they're also about sort of what this film is about, which is civility, common ground. Is it elusive? Those films are about young people in politics. But
right.
So I guess I'm drawn back to politics. It's inescapable now, and I want to find creative ways to bring audiences to these conversations.
It seems like you're also drawn to sort of somewhat idealistic characters, right? I mean, Boy State and Girl State, these are kids who are going off to basically pretend to be in a legislature. It's very earnest. I mean, Pete Buttigieg is sort of like the walking embodiment of earnestness in politics. There's not, and even in this film too, in War Games, while it's very dark, it's not cynical. I mean, it's hopeful in a sense, because it's trying to say we don't have to be like this. But there's a sort of optimism in your work, it seems.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you see that. I think it's important. Also, I don't. And this is true of the young people on Boy State and Girl State. Even though they're 17 and they're optimistic, they're not naive, And
right.
There's a healthy politics that they model for us. Well, there's bad behavior in Boy State. There's dirty tricks, right? But Girl State less so. I love that they're not. I don't think anybody in the room in War Game, Steve Bullock, Heidi Heitkamp, Wes Clark, I mean, they're not naive, right? They've been through tough campaigns. They've probably seen the worst, mudslinging and all that stuff. And yet I think they're and I don't think that the characters that they play in this game are far different from who they are themselves. And I think that, and I've been able to travel the country with some of them to promote the film and gotten to know them. And I think that they remain hopeful despite having every reason to,
right.
They lost their jobs, their political jobs, but they're still committed to the process. And so I think the films give me some kind of comfort. And I do think hopefully model something that we need to see more of, and I do think seeing the president, played by Steve Bullock, and his advisors just kind of model decision-making in a not always easy, sometimes contentious, but ultimately sort of reasonable way is I think a value, hopefully.
How did the Pete Buttigieg film come about?
As do many of these projects, people I know knew people who knew people. Yeah. Pete was hadn't even officially announced his campaign, but was going to announce to run. He was mayor of South Bend. He had nothing to lose at that stage in inviting a camera. His disposition to the media is pretty friendly and open. Yeah. And he's a younger candidate who's sort of more willing to throw out the conventional rules about what, might be acceptable. And he was pitched this idea by somebody he went to Harvard with who knew him. And I think it was, I went out there. At first I said no. But then I looked at his first CNN appearance and I thought, okay, this is interesting. He's not going to go far, but I love the idea that we could have access to someone running for president. Like, what is it like to run for president? Just from the day-to-day inside human perspective. And I met him in Shaston and I was fascinated that he was he had these two jobs simultaneously, at least initially, which was mayor of South Bend, not a very glamorous job, and then presidential candidate, sort of toggling between these two lives. And it began as let's try it out. And if you don't like it and I don't like it, we'll part ways. And but I was working by myself too. I don't like to work with War Games, the exception, that we had 80 people on the crew. But making the Pete film was just me.
Wow. You just falling around with the camera.
Yeah, I mean, maybe like you, just pad and
Yeah.
pen, and it sort of allows you to kind of not hide, because I don't think you ever hide as a documentary filmmaker, but just
Yeah.
kind of be unobtrusive, be respectful. You come in with a crew, and you're like a crew, you're like a network, you have a certain weight and freight, and I like to work when making that kind of movie. I like to work by myself.
There's an intimacy to it, I would think, that you can't. Having a crew in the room can kind of, maybe put people on their performance edge as opposed to just being themselves.
Absolutely, and already with a professional politician, the sort of the performative by trade, I think, sort of understanding Pete and his relationship with Chasten, and the journey that he was on as a gay man, becoming a national candidate, and sort of balancing his personal story and sort of the policies that he was trying to articulate. That was the balancing act that he was engaged in, that I found to be so interesting. Also, having access to debate prep, which I'd never, sort of bit like the Situation Room in the White House, right? It's sort of where the stuff's getting hashed out before the public sees it. And I don't know if you've been in debate prep before, but it was a bit arcane. And also the challenge we had in War Game was like, because the exercise was 6 hours, and they got into the granular detail of, statutes that govern the deployment of the Guard under state or federal control. And
Right.
It's very hard to follow. And we had to kind of weed out some of that stuff. And debate prep was a little bit like that. But I think there was sort of beneath that was something more interesting going on, which was someone learning how to communicate, and the process of sort of listening to his advisors and saying, how much of their advice do I take, and how much has to be me? How do I hold on to me? And that's a little bit of a challenge you see with Steve Bullock here playing the president, is, how do you weigh the two? Like, you've been elected because of your reasoned judgment, presumably. And how do you take in all these opinions and filter them out and decide what to take and what to leave behind?
Having made a film now about people trying to communicate in crisis and, imagining demagogues in that process, having followed around an actual real life political candidate, who has gone on to pretty great heights and clearly has a very big political future in store. Have you learned anything about what makes an effective political communicator?
I'd say I learned this in Boy State, shooting teenage boys in Texas in 2017. There's a kid in the film we met. He's a progressive in a sea of conservatives. He's a Bernie supporter, and they're all like red meat, rabid right-wingers, proclaiming their love of guns and masculinity. And the film is really about his rise to power. And what I learned, I guess I learned that those true powers are not really learned. I think you're gifted them. He's a very unassuming guy, and he's a great listener. And I would say that's true of Pete too. And I think true of Steve Bullock in this film, playing the president. This kid is a great listener, but then he has an ability to connect with his audience, which is extraordinary. Pete has a little bit of that too. And I don't think you can learn that. I think it's a gift you carry, and not the people there's a girl in Girl State who you think has the gift and doesn't. And there's a boy in Boy State who you think doesn't have the gift and does. And I think it's like, the ability of a musician. When they sing, you just hear it. There's a way of expressing themselves that feels like it comes from the heart, and I think for better and for worse, Trump has it, right? No question about it.
Yeah, and his is not based on empathy, it seems to me.
It's not. That's right. And I think that the contest in Boy State was a powerful mirror of those two ways of communicating, of sort of hope and fear, of empathy and the opposite of empathy, of sort of the strong man posturing. And we know, fear is a powerful motivating force. I mean, what you hear, it's not that what you hear from Trump gives you comfort, but it cuts through, and he has a way of holding his audience in his hand. And I don't know what the takeaway there is, but it's really interesting to have the kind of sample 17-year-olds trying on this stuff and sort of seeing what works and what doesn't work. And you know, the contest in those films often between the candidates is sort of those who have rhetorical powers and those who run the ground game and shake every hand, and those who are skilled in social media too. And do you have to have all three? Probably, really, to succeed. I mean, I think it's interesting because I watched Kamala on the 2020 campaign as an opponent, one of Pete's opponents, in the late stage and the campaign field, and sort of measuring. We all got to. There were so many candidates, as there often sometimes are, and sort of measuring who brought what skill to the table, and it's just and but people can evolve and change, but I think fundamentally there's a certain gift that you're born with or you're not. That's my feeling.
Yeah, and I don't think you can fake it either. I mean, it's just people can tell when it's phony and it's not real sympathy and it's not real instinct. And it's something. It's so interesting about Pete Buttigieg is that when you see him talk to conservative audiences on Fox News and other conservative outlets, it comes across as completely authentic.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's true too. I mean, I think that audiences. I mean, this film, War Game's an interesting test too. I mean, we know they're play acting, but there's a willing suspension of disbelief when we go to the theater. It's a constructed environment, and yet we are by the strength of conviction of the intensity of performance, we buy in. We become invested in the drama as though this was a real story and these were real people. And I think that there's an alchemy in War Game, which is that we're watching theater, but we're allowed to invest, and we bring ourselves a lot to that engagement. I think the film respects what we all bring, allows us to bring those things, also gives us room to invest in the drama. And I think to also take away what we will individually. It's not a prescriptive film, doesn't tell you how to vote, right? Doesn't tell you who the right candidate to support is in this election. Doesn't even tell you what the right decision is, just shows you the decision that this president makes in that moment. And I've been polling the audience, and if people want to go see the film, I'm curious about their own response, because we talked about the Insurrection Act. Do you choose to invoke or not? It's your choice, and it's our choice as a country,
Yeah. Well, that is a great note to end on for what is a hopeful film, I think, in the end. But before we go, it's our tradition on Chatters. I reach into the chatter box, which I have right in front of me, and I'm going to ask you a question that's been pre-written and selected at random to close out our conversation. So your question is, this is a good one. Okay. Tell us your favorite or least favorite spy or political thriller movie or TV show. A favorite or a least favorite of the spy genre or the thriller genre?
I love The Bureau, the French television.
So good. Right. It's so good.
I was just talking to somebody about that. I watched it in COVID, totally transfer. I love how kind of drab it begins in the drab office setting, but yet the intrigue is significant as any Bond spectacle to me.
Totally.
Yeah, love it.
And if I was recommended it by a former CIA operative who said, if you really want to see what it's like to work in the intelligence community and espionage, it's a French TV show that you have to watch. It's really superb. And I'm thrilled that you watch it. And you got turned on to it in COVID too, you said?
Yeah, so that gets my endorsement. And I think maybe we can relate to it because there's sort of, it's like offices we've all worked in on some level. It sort of strips away some of the imagined grandeur and glamour of espionage work, and it just it was good. I'm waiting for the American adaptation. It couldn't possibly be better than the French version.
I know, and I'm kind of like I'm a little bit. I wince at what the American adaptation might be like, but who knows? Maybe in the right hands, it can come off. But I hope so. Well, Jesse Moss, thank you so much for coming on. The film is War Game. People can see it in theaters. It'll be streaming this month in August too. Yeah.
Well, it's in theaters through September. We have a website, wargamefilm.com, which has all of our screening dates, and it'll have news about. We're going to be available online in late September, early October too. So you can see it before the election for sure at your home. But if you want to have a conversation, come out to the theater.
That's great, and I hope people do. It's a really instructive film and an incredibly exciting one. It is like a thriller. It's a great way to spend some time watching a movie in addition to learning something. So, Jesse, thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about it. Appreciate
Thanks, Shane. Appreciate it.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.